there's a very viral thread on um, Twitter which says that uh, ChatGPT is my CEO, and there's a guy building a company based on the recommendations that ChatGPT is giving him,
Right.
and he's asking the ChatGPT for all the how do I market this, how do I promote this, how do I get stuff for this and that, and he's posting those replies on the Twitter thread, and then he's acting on top of that, and he's now built a decent company. I think they are at somewhere close to 500,000 or so. Hi Naren, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks,
So,
Pratish. Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
so Naren, in your journey, you have made multiple pivots, right? Before finally concluding with Wolfia. How would you explain the process of identifying the need to pivot in a startup?
That's a really good question. The kind of way I think about it, um, at the earliest stages, you really need to orient yourself towards learning, iterating, and adapting. So initially, when um, we initially started with a fintech idea right into when we got into YC. And we quickly learned that it wasn't the best founder market fit just by talking to a lot of people and realizing that, like, hey, even though we worked at this fintech company for a really long time, we're probably not the right people to solve this particular problem. And I think like a lot of those insights came from actually talking to people. So one of the things that if in the case someone is building their company or whatever, like you really need to get yourself in front of customers and actually have those conversations. And I think like once we realized like, hey, mobile, which we've been doing for a really long time, me and my co-founder, is a better fit for us. We dug really deep into what are the problems that we've faced in the domain and sort of like dug deep there. And that's kind of how we landed on the two ideas that we've been trying out. And I think like the more recent sort of pivot, if you want to call it that, is more like us iterating, I would say. I think like we've been trying to build smaller MVPs, putting it out there, seeing how it works, talking to people, seeing how it resonates. And when we realize like, hey, this doesn't really resonate, that's kind of like when we try out a different idea. And that's kind of how we currently landed with what we're building with automating mobile releases. So just like being open-minded, open to just like iterating, just learning what the market needs, because at the end of the day, what the market needs is what's going to win. So just like listening, iterating is kind of how we ended up with this idea now.
I think talking to your customers and listening to the market is startup 101, right? Uh, every founder talks about it, everyone knows about it, but a lot of people are not able to do it. I don't, first and foremost, I would want to love to, if you could talk about why people face a lot of resistance in talking to their customers. And also, what would be the best way to talk to your customers, understand their needs? Let's say someone who's starting up and has not launched a product, right?
Those are really good points. To answer your first question, I think like sometimes I've seen a lot of people just motivated by fear, not put yourself out there. So just like launching has a fear in itself that like people are not going to try you out or like they're going to reject the grand vision that you've come up with. So people kind of resist just launching. And I think like even us, like we had to learn the lesson the hard way that like putting yourself out there is one of the first things you got to do. Just like trying to get out there, launching on Hacker News, launching on LinkedIn, like launching on Bookface and Product Hunt, just like putting yourself out there is a great way to get feedback as early as possible. I think like that's primarily the best way to get your initial users or an initial set of people interested in the idea that you're trying to solve. And another big aspect is solving a problem in your expertise or area of expertise, which lends itself to you already knowing a lot of people who might have similar problems. And the way it manifested for us was that since we are mobile developers solving a mobile centric problem, we knew we had connections with a lot of mobile developers already. So what we kind of had to do was just like reach out to them in our network and start getting user interviews and like talk to them about their problems day to day and like what they face and how we could solve them. So I think like both of those combined, like launching early and you having the expertise in the problem that you're solving and like connections really helped us out, get a few customers or like few set of interviews to get started with that process.
So you launched on on multiple platforms, launched on Product Hunt and Bookvis and all of that. Uh, and then what do you do? What do you like? You call them up. You have a one-on-one meeting with them on Google Meet or Zoom call or something like that, or do you like read out their comments and have develop a thesis for the product?
Tactically speaking, um, we reach out to every single person that initially for us, when we launched on Hack and News, try to reach out to each and every single one and see if they have more comments or feedback. Um, and just like digging deeper into those comments and conversations are super important. Like Gustav from YC even says like even talking to them could lead to biases and wrong information because people don't contextualize the same information the same way. So just like sitting with them and having them walk through what they do day to day is super helpful. So if you're solving a problem, just like getting them on a video call and just like listening and seeing them do the work. So for us, it would be like, hey, how do you release your mobile apps? Can you actually show me what the process looks like? So rather than them sort of like trying to explain what they do, actually seeing them do it, you're going to find out a lot more inefficiencies and problems with their workflow that you're aware of that they are not. So like I would really recommend just actually going and like talking to those users rather than just like reading the comments or at a high level seeing what people interact with, and learning from that because you're going to learn a lot more when you're actually sitting and talking to them.
So, Naren, I remember when I was building a gaming company a few years back, I remember talking to our users, and we would get our entire team in a we had a very small team. We'll get them into a in a conference room. We'll discuss the set of 7 8 questions that we'll be calling up our users and discussing asking these questions. Uh, and probably the focus was trying to listen to them, trying to understand what they are saying rather than trying to probably probe them and understand what they're saying, right? Uh, and I believe that was the phase where the product changed rapidly, and the product changed the quickest changes and the fastest way to change your product and to probably come up with a mature product is that I believe, because that is where the product changed the most for us. What I want to understand is that when you're building Wilfia and you're doing a lot of these customer research, you're doing a lot of these customer calls, how did the feedback that was coming out from customers, how did that change your product, what kind of changes were you able to bring into your product? Yeah, any examples there?
That's a good question. I think I believe like since I worked at Wealthfront under Andy Ratcliffe, one of the things that he really pushed the product team at that point when we were talking to customers was like, unless you learn, like unless you were surprised about a learning from those user interviews, you're not really learning. So one of the things that we learned um, earlier during the customer research process for Wolfia was like even though developers are full on like very happy with automation, when it comes to like the end mobile releases where they're pushing out to production, they still didn't want to fully automate it. Like there was still some resistance to automating that process because of the risk involved. Like initially, since we were at a very high quality engineering company and like we were full on with automation and everything, we entirely automated as much as possible. But just like seeing that pushback even from developers about like not automating that was a surprise. So we had to tweak a couple of things where instead of just offering just like full on automation, like adding a button where you can manually release if you want to, and then slowly adopting the product and getting more people in, getting them used to the feel of like releasing the app through Wolfia, and then slowly getting them to see the benefit of scheduling releases and scheduling automation. was an important insight that we thought would be easier to get people hooked on, but just realized that even though like there's a lot of value in automation, there's still a lot of pushback when it comes to fully automating everything. Um, and I don't think like we would have really realized that when we are building it in a vacuum. Like you got to put your product in front of customers and have them actually use it and see how they're using it, and learn from that.
So nice. So, Naren, you're currently working on Wolfia, right? And you're simplifying the process of releasing apps on the Play Store and the App Store, right? Can you tell us, but still, can you tell us in your own words what Wolfia does and go into the details of it? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, so right now, since the couple of pivots, we're helping mobile developers and release managers save time by automating their mobile app releases. So, for instance, rather than spending time manually monitoring your crash reporting tools like Sentry and adjusting rollouts over time, we seamlessly integrate with all of these APIs to handle these tasks automatically so that your team doesn't end up spending a whole lot of time just like manually doing these tasks. So I think like taking a step back, I think it's important to kind of understand what releasing apps generally mean. And I think like there's two pieces to it. One is just building the artifact that needs to be uploaded. So this is compiling the code that you just wrote up and generating the artifact. And this is usually fully automated. Most teams have a good CI system and a build system that just like generates either the IPA file for iOS or APK file for Android. And then this file that gets generated needs to be uploaded and distributed to the App Store and the Play Store, and that is where we come in. So right now, today, if you go look at a general team, what usually happens is once these artifacts are generated, they go in, take those artifacts, submit it for review on the App Store and the Play Store, wait for the review to complete, and in the case it's successful, start rolling it out to users slowly. And this is painful. There's a lot of manual process involved, and it's usually assigned to the tech lead or the release engineer that does all of these manually for the most part. There are automation tools out there like Fastlane that try to automate things as much as possible, but they fall short today because Fastlane is kind of part of the CI process, which means it's a one-shot tool that basically pulls and submits it for review, but doesn't automatically roll it out, etc. And that is where we come in. What we do is once the app is submitted, we wait for the review, and in the case the review is successful, automatically start rolling it out. And not only that, we also integrate with your crash reporting tool like Sentry, and we pull for any crashes, check if the crash rate is exceeding, if it's exceeding a threshold, we automatically halt your release and manage the entire rollout process. And that's something like people do manually, like folks who are on call, um, just like switch back and forth to these tools, see if the crash rate is high, and then manually halt the rollout and do all of this manually. And I think like we are just getting started. This was a pain point that we felt personally at Wellspring and wanted to automate that. And there's a whole lot of other enterprise companies that are going through the same pain point. And that's kind of what we're trying to solve with Wolfia right now.
I think even as a young startup, we have faced that those pain points multiple times, having to roll back things manually and do things over and over again and again. Yeah, and having to track those things manually every time, right? With that apprehension of I don't know what will break, right? But you got it. But I want to talk about Y Combinator a bit. You got into Y Combinator early with your product, right? How has YC and Y Combinator shaped your understanding and also the product and the and building the company at large? Yeah.
That's a really good question. And I think like there's a common misconception that you need to have a product basically to get into YC. For us, that wasn't true. Um, We applied with an early stage idea, right out of getting out of Wealthfront. We went into the interview. The idea itself didn't work out, but during the interview, we iterated on a bunch of ideas because we had expertise in fintech and mobile, and YC was happy to have us with those ideas. They basically helped formulate the kind of problems that we are trying to solve today. And I think like people are hesitant to apply to YC because they think like, hey, I'm too early for YC. I think like that's totally false. YC really evaluates founders and see how they are in their career and how they're thinking and how gritty they are, and try to get them into YC instead of like just evaluating the product, because I think like they've had so many successful founders start really massive companies after getting into YC and pivoting. Um, so for us, that was exactly true. Like we didn't really have a product when we got into YC. And I think like to answer your second question, we learned we learned a lot of great things from YC, a lot of which were counterintuitive. Like you wouldn't really think like, hey, this is how massive companies got built. Because one of the first advice is like, don't go getting a bunch of customers and getting them to slightly like you, but find a few folks who really, really love the product that you're building. So basically try to get 10 customers who love you and who are willing to go and talk to their friends about you, rather than like finding 100 or 1,000 people who are like, yeah, this is a cool product. Um, and that was just something that you wouldn't think of intuitively, but that's one of the first learnings that we had. And I think like there's tons more if you want me to keep going about it. But yeah.
I remember an advice from YC which was build things that don't scale. It seems
Yeah.
like I said, it seems so counterintuitive,
Yeah.
but it's so obvious when you think about it. But yeah, I think so. I want to say that Wolfia is at a very early stage, right? At this stage of the business, what are your biggest challenges?
For us right now, I think it's very similar to any early stage company, which is just like getting customers. Um, and I think like that trickles down into other problems that you see. But I think like fundamentally, what we're having challenges with is just like getting more people into the funnel, getting more people excited about the product, and finding the people that have the problem. So we're trying to solve those in multiple ways. Like we're trying to um, like write blogs and do unscalable things like going to conferences and like literally going to places where our customers exist. And I think like that's the most tricky part of any problem that you're solving, which is like finding those people who have the particular problem within in a hair on fire sort of instance, that they want to solve. And I think like for us in particular, we want to find people who are willing to automate their builds, who are looking to scale their process from one person just releasing the app to maybe a team of five who wants to automate and improve their process. So it's really finding the people at the right instance when they
Naren,
want to improve the process.
yeah, Naren, I have a quick question here that you mentioned you're trying to get customers. Why not, let's say, run a little a dozens of ads and get these customers and then probably look at their feedback, look at their understanding of the product and the need of the product.
So initially, when you're trying to find early customers,
I mean,
you,
it's similar to what YC says, right? Do things that don't scale. What you're doing right now is probably going to conferences, trying to reach out to and meet these people personally, right? Which is something that doesn't scale, which is something that YC also advises. But yeah, for the general public, for everyone, for our audience, why do things like that, and why not run ads which can totally scale, right?
I think like right now, um, you're when you're at such an early stage, you don't really know what resonates with the public. Like you don't really know what to put in the ad for everyone to be attracted with it and like come to your product, automatically sign up and like buy you. So I think like ads are a great way to scale when you know what exactly you're solving, what exactly resonates with the group of customers that you already have, and when you're going from like a product market fit stage to scaling stage, but doesn't really work when you're pre-product market fit and when you're like just now trying to figure out what's the exact problem that you're solving, what's the exact pain point that you're solving, and what resonates with the customers. And I think like that's one of those. I think like people are usually enticed by trying to scale and like trying to sort of like work around these tougher problems of meeting the people, like talking to the customers. But I think like that's usually a mistake. And what it sometimes lends to is like you get a bunch of customers who are not high intent, doesn't necessarily want to solve the same problem as the problem that you're solving, which lends itself to different types of feedback that are all over the place and lends yourself to wasting a bunch of time. And 6 months down the line, you want to pivot again because you don't know what exactly you're solving. And that's how I've come to see it play when people are like trying to scale with ads when they don't necessarily have a product that works.
I totally agree. I think uh, meeting customers and doing these things that don't scale actually is part of the process of building the product, right? You get a lot of insights that eventually get pushed into the product itself. And you get a lot of insights on how to reach out to these customers eventually when you're looking to scale, right? Uh,
Exactly. And
I,
especially like when you're building a go-to-market strategy eventually to scale, you when you're hiring people to do the scaling, you want to give them a playbook ideally of these are the things you should do to get these customers. And if all you have is like, hey, run these ads, that's like usually it's not like one, not good unit economics, and two, most likely doesn't work in the long run.
yep, yep, yep. And you've worked in tech for a very long time, right? And you've worked across multiple domains. So, what made you zero down on the idea of Wolfia and the idea of say automating mobile releases?
I think two things in particular. One is we're really solving a pain point that we felt personally. So when I managed the mobile infrastructure teams at Beltran, this was something that we just did every couple of weeks, where we would release it, roll it out, see if we need to halt releases, and then just like manually do this back and forth. So it's more like solving a pain that we personally felt, which I think is one of the ways to sort of work around, not really work around, but sort of enhance and know that a problem truly exists. Um, and the other side of the equation is while we were solving and like trying to talk to customers with our previous idea, we heard this a whole lot. Like we were hearing like, hey, like we have problems with our releases. Would you mind solving those problems? And I think like putting those two and two together kind of led to us focusing on automating mobile releases. Um, and that's where like the concept of founder market fit really plays in. And I think like YC helped us figure this out during the batch, where like one since you have expertise in one domain, you can weed out when people are just like I'm not sure if you've heard of the mom test. It's a really good book about validating what your customers are talking about, whether they're actually speaking from a place where they felt the pain, or are they just like trying to convince you that you have a cool idea. Um, so I think like when you have found a market fit, you can really weed out a lot of those niceties and sort of appreciations about this cool idea that you're working and like actually nail down the problem that you're trying to solve. And I think like that's kind of like how we ended up in this place.
So, Naren, talked about trying to differentiate between the niceties of the world and the actual core problems that people end up discussing. And also, well, I want to dwell on that a little bit. I want to understand what kind of uh, how do you probe a customer? How do you talk to a customer that so that they end up giving you valuable information? They end up sharing their pain points with you. They end up sharing also the true product feedback with you, right? What kind of questions do you prepare? Do you even prepare questions, or is it like mostly impromptu?
So we have a couple of um, high-level questions that we start conversations with, but for the most part, since it's developers talking to developers, most of the conversation organically happens. But I think like one thing to particularly note when trying to probe and see if they actually have the problem is what actions they've done in the past to sort of resolve those problems. So instead of talking about hypotheticals about like, hey, this is the problem that we are solving, are you interested? Sort of instead of leading with that, like actually seeing what they've done to solve the problem that you're talking about. So instead of asking them like, hey, how painful is your release process, asking them what your release process is and have you tried to improve it, sort of like gets them talking about like, hey, we do this rollout thing which is right now manual and cumbersome, um, and I've looked at other products to see if like I could solve it. I've tried to solve it with Fastlane and it doesn't really solve the problem. Like when people talk about trying to solve that problem in the past, that's when you kind of know that they've had the problem. And the second part of that is confirming that they want to spend money to actually solve the problem. Like a lot of people have problems that they want to solve, but they don't really want to pay for it to go away. So, sort of evaluating that um, need is also key to knowing if they really have the problem or whether they're just like making conversation. Because it's easy to fall into that flow of like, hey, this is what I'm solving, and then they're like, hey, this is cool. Would you want to buy? And they'd be like, hey, I would love to try if you built it, and you end up going down this path of just like building a product when you actually don't have a need in the market. And I think like I would highly recommend the book called Mom Test, which helped us learn a lot of these. I think like we've done this mistake before, and like personally learned um, with the previous pivot that like you really need to validate um, before you actually go and build a product. And I think like you can almost take it to an extreme. Like sometimes if you're building like an enterprise kind of product, I've seen founders just mock things up in Figma, go and get contracts or like things signed up before they even write any piece of code. And I think like that's the best sort of validation. Like if someone is literally paying you to build the product even before it exists, they have the problem. You could be sure of that.
Yep, yep. I think I think the way a lot of people build products, and I remember listening to someone, uh, I don't exactly recall the company, but what they used to do is that they used to talk to their customers, probe them, list down all the problems on a whiteboard, and bucket them into, say, high priority, high effort, high priority, low effort, low priority, low effort, low priority, high effort. List them into these four buckets, and then start picking up low effort, high priority tasks first, and then that they would put them in their sprints and everything. That is practice that I have adopted over the years and have been following across my various startups in the past as well. I think, and the book that you talked about, the book Mom Test, I've heard of the book so many times from so many founders. I think now it's high time I get to read this now, right? Uh,
Absolutely.
so before Wolfia, you were working with Wealthfront, right, for almost close to 5 years, uh, and you were leading teams there. How did you go about this mentality change from building tech and engineering teams to now building a company, which is a totally different ball game altogether? Which very often what I realize is a lot of founders don't get that. A lot of people when they jump into startups or jump into building their own company, they don't get the fact that it's a very different animal altogether. It's not the same as building a product or building an engineering team that we have been doing in the past. How did you go about that mentality change? Yeah.
I think that's exactly right. Like, I think there are two. completely different problems. I think like there, at Wealthfront, just to briefly speak about my experience there, um, I joined Wealthfront as a mobile engineer, working on the Android team, and then grew to managing the infrastructure team. And I learned a whole lot. Like I was working, the company was founded by Andy Ratcliffe, who was one of the best investors out there, and honestly, entrepreneur as well. Learned a whole lot about product market fit, and just like general philosophy about company building from him. There was a very high caliber talent in the company. The engineers there were extremely talented, learned a lot of what I'm practicing today from there, and also found my co-founder there, which is also nice. And I think even though I had, like, personally, I had such benefits from working at a good, like, big pros product market fit company, I was solving like such smaller problems. Like I was basically growing a team and solving a localized problem of improving the infrastructure so that other engineers can work more efficiently and have a better experience. And comparatively speaking, starting a company basically is from the ground up thinking through the problem that we're trying to solve, validating that with like real users, and actually going in and by yourself building it from the ground up, which requires like a totally different set of skills than when you're managing a team per se, or even just like locally building or improving the Android app. I do think those two things are related. I think like a lot of what I learned and expertise that I developed at Wealthfront is useful when I'm building this company. But I think like the type of problems that you end up solving are very, very different and it takes various shapes. I think um, it's also a lot more challenging from that perspective, where instead of like you being a cog in a very big machine, here you are kind of the machine. Like you're getting to try a bunch of things, learn from it, and take a lot more risks. Whereas like when you're part of this big company, you don't necessarily have the room for trying out completely different things. Like a good example is right now, even though I'm the technical founder, my primary function is to find more leads, talk to them, and get them converted. Like you wouldn't imagine an engineering manager going into a user research org in a big company and like try to have conversations with customers. Like that usually doesn't happen. There are exceptions out there for sure, but there are always outliers. But here you get to do everything. Like you just need to develop skills in every which way. And I think like generally for me, at least, it's a lot more exciting and a lot more challenging. And I think like in the last year that I've been doing this, I've learned like so much more just by actually trying, failing, and then improving that you don't get to do at bigger companies.
I think what you said, you talked about, say, you as a technical founder also going out there and doing a lot of user research. That's a very common, phenomena in the startup ecosystem, right? Especially with founders. What I want to understand is that, see, there's a theory going out there that which says that you need to have 10,000 hours of work, or 10,000 hours of, you need to have spent 10,000 hours on something to be an expert at that, right? But as a founder, what happens is that suddenly when you're transitioning from an engineering manager to a founder now today, what happens is that you end up doing a lot of stuff. You are your first sales guy, you're your first HR, you're your first I don't know, marketing person, you're your first tech lead, you're a first junior developer as well, you're a first I don't know, every probably every aspect of the company, you're your first hire, right? So how as a founder do you end up bringing that expertise, which say, empirically speaking, in a bookish manner, which wants, which demands 10,000 hours of work in that domain?
That's a really good question. And I think the way I think about it, you don't necessarily need to be experts at all of those. Here, what really you need to do is the 80/20. Like, what's that insight about sales that I can figure out that's going to help me get my first 10 customers? Like, what's the insight that I can learn about marketing that I can get Wolfia to more and more people? Like, and I think like YC really helps out with this by having such a huge network of people that you can talk to. Because I've talked to a bunch of founders about sales. Like, since I come from a background of a B2C company, where I've been mostly the engineering manager, one thing that I don't know a whole lot about is sales. So just like having the ability to talk to like the YC group partners and other founders who've done a whole lot of sales and like quickly gain from them tidbits that work and implement them in your day to day goes a really, really long way. So, sort of like to put it concisely, relying on experts that you have in your network to kind of lean on and also doing the 80/20 actually gets you a lot farther away. And I think like the other piece of it is that like every company is unique in that you as the founder have to be the sort of trailblazer in figuring out a lot of that stuff. Like you have to figure out what exact go to market works. You have to go and figure out like what's the exact language that resonates with people. Like what's the value prop that you need to put in front of your users? What's how do you want to tell your story? And only then can you like train and bring in people who can actually do the job. And I think like that's a huge part of it.
So, what stage do you think is the right time to bring in experts? You talked about, say, trying to figure out first, but do you want to talk about it in terms of numbers, in terms of, I don't know, what could be the product stage or the sales number stage where you would want to bring in more and more experts?
I think that's hard to quantify in terms of numbers because each company is different. But I think the way I've sort of like thought about it is when you know you have product market fit and when you know yet that your product that you've built can be something that you scale. And that's exactly when you bring in like a VP of sales, VP of marketing, VP of engineering, when you know, hey, this is going from 0 to 1 to a stage where you're more company building. And until then, I think it's super important to keep the team lean and not hire or like bring in experts whose incentives are more gonna be doing the thing that they're experts on rather than experimenting, learning, and iterating. Because I think like that's fundamentally the job of the founder. And like trying to outsource that usually leads to more problems than those being solutions, at least at the very like pre-product market fit stage.
I think you talked about building a lean team, keeping it lean till you reach a product market fit, and then getting people experts onboarded right at VP level and all of those things. I think one of the core problems that a lot of startups face is that, and especially I think also a lot of people who have been involved at before the pre PMF in the pre PMF stage faces that now so far let's say it takes a year to reach the PMF stage. They have been deeply involved in building product. They have been they understand the ecosystem entirely. They understand the product much better than probably even the users or probably even sometimes the senior people, right? And then suddenly someone comes in as an expert, jumps in into the company and becomes a VP and then starts dictating terms. Now, in such a scenario, what happens is that there is a lot of friction in both parties. That is something that I've experienced personally. There's a lot of friction from the team as well, who are trying to adopt to a new leader now. There is a lot of friction. There are a lot of pains that the senior person also faces in the company, right? Who's trying to now run things his or her own way. How do you think people should deal with that, or say founders should deal with that? Uh, these problems that are bound to occur. Yeah. So let's say, how do you deal with a problem like this when this expert that you onboarded as a VP, he comes to you and tells you that there's a lot of friction on the team, and they don't. Also, what happens is that typically don't fully understand the process, right? They don't fully understand the nuances of every of the product, as well as the minor pieces that are built in the product.
Yeah, I can't really speak to that mostly because we haven't really gone to that phase, I think,
Mhm.
yet. So the few people that we've kind of hired are so we've mostly kept the team lean, meaning that we just have an engineer that we've onboarded that I've previously worked with. And there, um, you want people who are willing to take that risk of being part of your journey of finding the product that works. So at least initially, at the pre-product market fit stage, you want people who are trying to experiment, trying like who are totally okay just iterating on the product, or okay, just like you going through a pivot. And I think like that kind of changes as you're scaling. Like you're gonna bring in experts who know really what they're talking about, and I can see how that could be that could cause a lot of friction when founders who basically steered the ship all the way getting there. But I personally I haven't had experience going through that problem, so I can't talk
I
through
think,
that honestly.
in my personal experience, what I've seen is that uh, somebody, in fact, everyone has to eventually go through that painful process. There's no way out. You have to gradually take it. So you have so far what has happened is you have had a lot of people on your team who take the company from 0 to 1, and then you get a lot of people on your team who take the company from 1 to 100, who will be eventually taking the company from 1 to 100. And there is no, I have not been able to find a better way, but there is no way to probably bypass that pain and uh, reach a stage where everybody is comfortable with everyone. I think that has to be more organic, and everybody has to go through that organic process. But yeah, I think in the initial phase of your startup, what are the key metrics that you're using to judge the success of a product team, and just the fact that whether you have been able to reach from a 0 to 1 or not?
That's a really good question. I think like this comes from YC, and this they basically ask us in one of the first sort of group office hours that they do, and clearly say that like, hey, if you're a B2B company, revenue should be the goal. Like, unless you have revenue, like they basically call out like, hey, anyone doesn't have revenue as the primary target that they're tracking, raise your hand basically. So we closely track our revenue. Um, and another piece of it is just like tracking the growth over time. The other axis that is kind of a leading indicator, like revenue in general tends to be a lagging indicator of all the things that you do. So one of the KPIs slash leading indicators that we track is the number of customers in the pipeline and the number of demos that we're doing. And putting those two and two together really lends to a healthy direction um, to take your company. So setting goals of like, hey, we would like to double, at least at the early stages, double our revenue in the next 2 weeks, and like trying the best you could do to sort of get there through other like tactical things like reaching out to X number of customers or prospects, doing X number of demos, meeting with like X number of leads, really helps sort of orient the company towards growth and the real target instead of meandering on things that don't matter.
So, Naren, what do you think about the recent tech boom, right? Especially with the disruption that is being created by OpenAI and ChatGPT for the general audience. How are you planning to incorporate it in your own business as well?
Yeah, it's been quite magnificent to watch just the amount of disruption that the LLM models are creating in the market today. I think it's fascinating, and I'm like really optimistic about the future that it holds. I think it's one of those things that happens really once in a lifetime kind of thing, where it's a huge platform shift. Like I think it's gonna enable. I think like a lot of people are pessimistic in that there's a huge probability that there's gonna be a lot of job losses because of AI. I think while that's gonna be true, and I see that already happening in a bunch of areas, I think this also enables people to do more in general and to sort of ground it. I think like it just enables people to be more productive, which in a sense is deflationary in nature, but also enables like so much more improvements. Like a classic case of question that's going around the world today is like, hey, are all developers going to lose their jobs? I don't think that's true, at least in the near term. I think AI is going to enable developers to be 5 to 10x more productive because I see that day to day. Like I use ChatGPT on a daily basis to just like accelerate what the problems that I'm trying to solve. Like scripts that it would take me an hour to write are taking me 5 minutes to write, which is insanely good. And I think like um, overall, it's going to enable um, us to solve more problems with lesser amount of effort and human capital, which I think unlocks us to solve more problems. There are like so many problems that I think like require human capital that are not necessarily being funded or like people are not spending time working on. And I think like this just enables us to go like expand and like solve the various other problems that already exist.
And like the entire world is trying to adopt ChatGPT and OpenAI and try to build certain products around ChatGPT in their uh, own space. I think at my own company, we have been building certain products on over and above on top of OpenAI ChatGPT. Do you have anything on in your own pipeline uh, building on top of say OpenAI APIs?
It's a good question. So we one of our customers had this cool idea of like, hey, I don't really know what I'm releasing with each releases. Can you somehow use AI to tell me that? So one of the things that we did in our product was as you're clicking the release button, we ingest all your commits basically and sort of like ask ChatGPT like, hey, tell us what are all the user facing changes that are being made as part of these commits. And it does a surprisingly good job of describing basically a release notes. Like we've automated release notes with AI, and people seem to love them. People seem to be really attracted to the notion of like them just being able to click a button and auto-generate release notes without having to go through all of their commits in a certain amount of time and manually generate it. And I think like it scales really well too. Like when there's like multiple teams working on multiple products and everything gets released in as part of one release, this also gives them an overview of everything that's going out rather than 5 separate product managers keeping track of all of that, etc. That's just like one small use case. And another interesting use case that we are experimenting with is since we have access to folks' crash reporting data, we are basically looking into automating fixes for those crashes. So we're able to feed it the crash reporting um, along with the code. and basically, hey, like generate a diff that would solve this issue, and it does a pretty decent job. Where like 90% of the time, it actually gets it exactly right. I think like we're just scratching the surface of what's possible. I think like right now we're sort of like retrofitting existing tools with AI, but I think like there's whole scale disruption waiting to happen. Like I think like APM tools, application performance management tools, are gonna look so much different 2 to 3 years from now, where they're built with AI from the ground up. So instead of like you seeing a list of all the crashes that happen in your product, it might be like, hey, this is the highest priority issue that we are seeing in production, and here's a fix for it. Like, do you want to merge and then auto release? That I think is gonna happen like very soon in the near future because of AI. And that's gonna unlock a level of productivity and quality of just software that's going out that just isn't there today.
I think it's brilliant that it's a coincidence that you mentioned APM and how that whole industry would also evolve. I was having that exact same discussion with a close friend of mine who runs this company called Signos. They're into APM and observability space.
Yep.
And yeah, I think it's a coincidence that you mentioned it. I think there is a lot that is happening in that space as well. I think Naren, you mentioned a lot of as far as OpenAI and ChatGPT and its implications are concerned. You mentioned a lot of new use cases that are coming up and things that probably humans were not capable of or required a lot of human intervention, a lot of human manual effort to get done is getting done today. But you also talked about a lot of job losses earlier, right? You talked about a lot of disruption that is leading to a lot of chaos, a lot of fear that people will be losing their jobs. And I think you might be aware of this. There's a very viral thread on Twitter which says that uh, ChatGPT is my CEO, and there's a guy building a company based on the recommendations that ChatGPT is giving him.
Right.
And he's asking the ChatGPT for all the how do I market this, how do I promote this, how do I get stuff for this and that, and he's posting those replies on the Twitter thread, and then he's acting on top of that, and he's now built a decent company. I think they are at somewhere close to 500,000 or a million ARR or something like that. Uh, Obviously, that's a
Wow.
very cool virality hack. But yeah, what's happening is that a lot of use cases are coming up where ChatGPT is actually replacing humans, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a lot of job loss that is happening. What kind of jobs do you think? How can someone prepare himself herself for the world to come, for the time to come? The time will be dominated by people who are, say, I don't know, who are very, I don't know, tech savvy or chat GPT savvy. I don't even know if it's the same thing anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know that they were doing that much revenue. That's insane. First off, but I think um, it's hard to predict the future. Um, but that's stated. I think like still there's going to be a world, like even in the future, I think there is a world in which we're going to automate a lot of these mundane and sort of tasks that doesn't require a lot of creativity, because that I think is the piece that's missing. Like you can like set up Auto GPT, host it on your local machine, give it a bunch of tasks, and it's able to sort of come up with a list of tasks and solve them. But still, I think like there is the lack of um, reasoning and creativity that I think is still missing. Probably going to be solved way in the future. But I think like I wouldn't change or stop learning anything for that reason. I think like people still need to learn coding. Like I think still people need to learn reasoning, mathematics, if you will. Like still develop the baseline skills that you need to have to.
But do you think any changes are required in the learning patterns? See, when you talk about these Gen Z people who have come out of college in the last 3 4 years, right? You can't but feel for them, right? They came out of college and probably entered into a world which was COVID struck, right? Which was struck by a pandemic, and that got followed up with a recession. The entire world economy is in downturn, and then after that you get a you get a disruptive piece of tech which is now taking away jobs. So what kind of changes probably this would require in the learning patterns to probably be able to better adapt to the changing world?
I think I would think about it slightly different than the way you characterized it. I would think, like, I would love to be 21 coming out of college with ChatGPT. Like, that I think is a great way to accelerate whatever it is that you're trying to learn, because I think like this is probably the best time in history where you can just like start a company on your own. Like I don't think you need funding anymore. Like I think like that world is like bootstrapping by itself just changed overnight, where you can just like use ChatGPT to build something of your own. And if you don't know about something, rather than like seeking experts, you have this whole corpus of data that is kind of the expert in basically any domain, and ask it for feedback and like iterate by yourself. And I think like people still should try being expert in something that they're passionate about. Like maybe you're passionate about education or like educating other people. I think like now you get to build your own edutech platform just with like a couple of engineers, whereas like previously that just wasn't possible. And I think like more than just thinking about like 5 years from now, there might not be the possibility of job of a particular category of jobs. I would think of how I can use the tool that exists today and leverage that to sort of accelerate whatever it is that you're building. I know that that's kind of an optimistic way to think about it, but that's kind of how I see the picture right now. I think like it's really hard to predict like where we're going to be 5 years from now, because like I wouldn't have predicted where we are today 3 months from now. Like I think like auto GPT is something that's changing very fast, and like it's gonna change like so many different things in so many different ways in the near future. Like 5 years from now is gonna be very hard to predict. So I think like the way to sort of counter that is stick to principles, like go back to first principles and think about what you can do to improve yourself. And I think like using a tool like ChatGPT is going to help you improve yourself much faster than when you're not. Um, so just like leveraging that is what I would recommend people to do.
I think that's an interesting take. I think this is the first time that I'm thinking about it this way. Actually I'm hearing someone talk about it this way. And there are a lot of I think you rightly pointed out there are a lot of new opportunities that will open up, a lot of new companies that will come up. The probably the time to build is way shorter now, right? And
Yeah.
that means that in itself means a lot more opportunities coming up in the future, and that's a brilliant take. I think. But yeah, I think thanks Naren for being here. That's it from the episode. And if the audience wants to reach out to you, what would be the best way to reach out? LinkedIn, Twitter, where are you most active?
Yeah, you can search for me on LinkedIn at Naren Mano, and the same handle on Twitter. And yeah, if anyone needs anything related to mobile, feel free to reach out. And thank you so much for having me, British. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks, Naren.
If you enjoyed this, then like, subscribe, and say a quick hi or share your thoughts and guests you want. Also, you'll find our community links in the description notes. Join now for networking or to stay updated and participate in the events, or just for connecting with the podcast guests. See you again in the next discussion.